The cicadas screamed in the heat, their steady chorus rising and falling with the pulse of the afternoon. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of turned earth and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle that crept along the fence posts. From the great house, a long shadow stretched across the yard, swallowing the dust and the broken cobblestones of the path. Beyond the gates, fields rolled into the horizon, green rows of cotton brushing the wind like the surface of some restless ocean. The plantation was alive, but its heart was not steady. Beneath the order of routine, something crooked was festering, something that none spoke of aloud, but all had begun to sense. Nathaniel Harwood stood on the veranda, broad shoulders tense beneath a cream linen coat, a glass of bourbon hanging in his hand. He was not an old man, though the deep lines etched into his face suggested otherwise. The burdens of land and legacy had carved themselves into him as surely as the sun had darkened his skin. His eyes tracked the yard, sharp, restless. He watched the slaves as they moved in the distance, watched the boys running baskets from one row to the next, watched the bent figures of the women whose backs glistened with sweat. He was a man who believed everything was his to control, yet tonight he felt that grip loosening. Inside the house, beyond the tall doors that framed him, his wife's laughter rang like a bell. Too light, too careless, it carried down the hall where he now heard footsteps pacing, a whisper of skirts dragging across polished wood. Nathaniel's hand tightened around the glass until he thought it might break. Celeste, always Celeste, weaving her charm, flashing that smile. A lady of refinement, admired by the county, yet rumors clung to her like perfume. She had been raised in New Orleans, daughter of a merchant who had squandered wealth and left her with little more than her looks and her sharpness of wit. Nathaniel had chosen her for both, and for years they had danced around each other like fire and kindling, attractive, dangerous, consuming when joined. But lately he had begun to wonder whether the fire was no longer his to command. In the kitchen below, Ruth stirred a pot with slow, deliberate motions, her face unreadable in the dim light. She had worked in that house since before Celeste had arrived, had carried Nathaniel's children when they were small, had patched sheets and mended coats. She was silent now, but her ears were sharp. She heard the mistress pacing, the master's heavy tread on the veranda, and she knew the house was swollen with storm. Even the other servants moved cautiously, keeping their voices low. Ruth's eyes flicked once to Samuel, who stacked wood by the hearth. He was younger, quicker, and too bold for his own good. He raised his brow at her, as if to say he too felt the shift, and she hushed him with the smallest shake of her head. Danger was thick in the air, and the wise knew better than to name it. Celeste paused at the parlor door, one hand grazing the polished frame. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the glass of the window opposite, a pale oval face, lips curved in a secretive half-smile. She was beautiful, but the kind of beauty that made enemies as swiftly as admirers. She looked out across the fields, then back toward the veranda, and for a moment her gaze caught Nathaniel's through the veil of dusk. They did not speak, but in that instant the silence said more than words. She knew what he suspected. He knew what she dared, and neither would confess it first. That evening, supper was tense, the long table gleaming under the weight of silver candlesticks and porcelain. Nathaniel sat at the head, eyes fixed on his plate, fork clattering once against the china, as though even the act of eating required discipline. Celeste sat opposite, graceful, every movement deliberate. She spoke of trivial things, the neighbor's new mare, the dress she had ordered from Mobile, but her tone was airy, too airy. Nathaniel responded little, and the servants who moved quietly between them sensed the air thickening. Every glance, every silence was a battle line. After the meal, Nathaniel excused himself to the study, though his drink went untouched. He opened the ledger, ran a finger down columns of numbers, but he did not see them. His mind was elsewhere, the whispers he had heard in town, the sidelong looks when he walked into the tavern, men who fell silent too quickly, women who exchanged smirks behind their fans, adultery, a word that stained like ink on paper, blotting reputation, destroying control. A man like him could not be made a fool, not here, not in Alabama where pride was worth more than coin. He pressed his hand to the desk until his knuckles whitened. Somewhere a clock ticked. Meanwhile Celeste slipped into the garden, the hem of her gown brushing dew-laden grass. Moonlight caught her hair, and she tilted her head as if listening to some melody beyond mortal hearing. She walked the path between roses, fingers grazing petals. To anyone watching, she was a vision, a lady at leisure. But her thoughts were sharper, darting. The night was her refuge, the place where she could imagine freedom, where the house's walls no longer pressed so close. She paused at the arbor, breath catching at the crunch of a branch behind her. She turned swiftly, but it was only Samuel, carrying a basket of kindling toward the sheds. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting look lay the truth. The slaves of this house saw everything. They saw her wanderings, her whispers, her secrets. And though they spoke not a word, silence could be as dangerous as any accusation. Ruth found her mistress still in the garden when she came to collect the empty wine glass. For a moment woman looked at woman, mistress at servant, and though the gulf between them was vast, Ruth felt a chill pass through her. Celeste's eyes were bright, restless, as if hiding something unspoken. Ruth curtsied, turned to go, but she knew the master would not rest until the truth was laid bare. She had lived long enough to know how quickly suspicion became violence. By midnight, the plantation lay hushed, the fields black beneath a veil of stars. But Nathaniel did not sleep. He stood at the window of his chamber, staring into the darkness, certain he had seen movement near the edge of the yard. The dogs barked once, then fell silent. He thought of Celeste, of the way she had smiled across the table, defiant in her elegance. He thought of the whispers, the smirks, the humiliating laughter that might echo through the county if the rumors proved true. His hand clenched at the curtain. He would know. He would uncover her betrayal if it killed him, and when he did, the punishment would be more than whispered scandal. It would be a reckoning no one would forget. And so, the first crack split the stillness of the Harwood plantation, a hairline fracture in the veneer of wealth and control. No one spoke of it yet, but every soul who lived within those acres felt it. The storm was coming, carried not by clouds, but by secrets, and secrets had a way of turning soil to blood. The morning broke with a haze that clung low over the fields, turning the cotton rows into pale ghosts stretching into the distance. The workers stirred at first light, their movements slow and silent, their breath rising like smoke in the cool dawn. A rooster crowed near the stables, sharp against the stillness, and from the big house a bell tolled once, calling the household awake. Inside, the smell of coffee rose bitter and dark, mingling with the faint scent of smoke from the kitchen hearth. Nathaniel Harwood had not slept, though he pretended otherwise when he descended the stairs, boots echoing across the polished wood. His face was composed, but his eyes betrayed a sleepless fury, the kind that gnawed a man from the inside until only suspicion remained. Celeste sat at the breakfast table already, wrapped in a pale gown, her hair pinned neatly despite the hour. She lifted her cup with delicate fingers, her eyes never leaving her husband's face. If she noticed the stiffness in his shoulders or the hollow beneath his eyes, she gave no sign. Instead, she spoke lightly of the day ahead, of linens that must be ordered, of a visitor expected from Montgomery in the coming week. Nathaniel listened but heard little. Every word sounded like a veil meant to distract him. He wanted to tear it away, to see what hid beneath, but he forced himself to remain silent. Pride required patience. Pride required proof. At the far edge of the dining room, Ruth served silently, her presence unnoticed except by Samuel, who lingered near the doorway under the pretense of carrying wood. He watched carefully, eyes flicking between master and mistress, measuring every pause, every hesitation. Samuel was young, his face still unlined by years, but his mind was sharp. He knew the weight of secrets, the way they could turn a house inside out. He had seen it before, when the overseer had vanished overnight 2 years prior. never to return. No one spoke of it now, but Samuel remembered. He remembered the silence that followed, the unasked questions. He saw that same silence creeping over the Harwood household like a slow fire. Later, Nathaniel rode out into the fields, his horse's hooves striking hard against the earth. He greeted no one, spoke to no one. The men bent lower as he passed. Women kept their eyes on their work, all of them sensing his mood. He dismounted near the far fence, staring out at the endless rows. His hand rested on the rail, fingers tapping restlessly. Somewhere out here, he thought, hidden in the vastness of his land, was the truth. Perhaps it lay in a whispered word carried between cabins, perhaps in the hush of footsteps on a moonlit path. He was determined to uncover it, to force it into the light. Celeste, meanwhile, walked the veranda with a parasol against the strengthening sun. Her pace was slow, graceful, but her mind was racing. She could feel Nathaniel's eyes upon her even when he was far from sight. He was watching, waiting, circling her like a hawk, and yet she would not cower. To show fear was to surrender, and Celeste had never surrendered in her life. Still, a seed of unease had rooted itself deep inside her. She knew what her husband was capable of when provoked. She had seen his temper flare at less. If he believed she had shamed him, there would be no measure to his wrath. She held herself straighter, forced her smile to remain fixed, but her heart beat faster with each passing hour. By midday, the air grew oppressive, pressing down on the house and fields alike. In the kitchen, Ruth whispered low to Samuel as they worked. "You watch your tongue," she said, her eyes darting toward the door. "You keep it shut, boy, or it'll bring you nothing but trouble." Samuel smirked faintly, but he nodded. He knew she was right. Yet part of him felt drawn toward the unfolding tension, as if he were watching a play too riveting to turn away from. He wanted to know, to see where it would lead. Knowledge was power, even for those who had none. That evening brought an unexpected guest. A carriage rattled up the drive, its wheels crunching over gravel, and from it stepped Elias Carter, a neighboring landowner with a smile too polished and a bow too courteous. Nathaniel greeted him with the measured warmth of necessity, for Elias was a man whose opinion traveled swiftly through the county. Celeste appeared on the veranda, her expression lighting with practiced charm. Nathaniel's jaw tightened as he watched her descend the steps, her hand resting lightly in Elias's as he bowed over it. The touch lingered a moment too long, or perhaps it was only Nathaniel's imagination, but it was enough. Fire burned low in his chest, controlled, hidden, but dangerous all the same. The evening passed in conversation, in clinking glasses and polite laughter, but beneath it ran a current of unease. Nathaniel watched every glance, every smile between his wife and their guest, cataloging them in the ledger of his mind. Celeste spoke with ease, her laughter lilting, while Elias's eyes lingered just enough to fan Nathaniel's suspicion. Ruth served silently, though she caught it all, storing each detail. Samuel lingered near the doorway again, pretending to sweep, though his ears were open, his gaze sharp. The house itself seemed to lean in, its walls holding the weight of secrets unspoken. When at last Elias departed, the night deep and heavy, Nathaniel stood long at the window, watching the carriage roll away. His hand curled against the sill, knuckles white. Behind him, Celeste moved quietly, her gown whispering across the floor. She paused near the doorway, her back straight, her head high. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them was vast, charged, a gulf filled with accusation and defiance. Then, without a word, she turned and ascended the stairs, leaving him alone in the shadowed room. Nathaniel remained there long after, the bourbon untouched on the table beside him. His reflection stared back from the dark glass of the window, stern, hollow-eyed, relentless. He knew what he must do. Proof was needed. Proof, and then justice. He would watch, he would wait, he would uncover the truth no matter the cost. And when he did, the reckoning would not be whispered but shouted. A punishment so severe it would silence every smirk, every rumor, every shadow of shame cast upon his name. Outside, the fields slept beneath the stars, but within the house the storm gathered strength. The players were in place, each bound by silence and secrets, each drawn into the web that stretched tighter with every breath. And in the dark corners, where servants whispered and watched, where eyes caught glimpses not meant to be seen, the truth was already known. It waited only for its moment, the strike that would splinter the Harwood household and echo far beyond its walls. The third day dawned hotter than the last, the sun burning white against a cloudless sky. Heat shimmered over the cotton fields, distorting the horizon so that the land seemed to breathe. By mid-morning, sweat ran in rivulets down every back, staining every shirt, yet Nathaniel Harwood felt nothing but the fever in his blood. He had risen before light, restless, prowling the house as if it were a cage. He paced the veranda, circled the garden, walked the halls, his boots echoing until Ruth closed the kitchen door to stifle the sound. The household felt his mood, brittle as glass. Even the dogs seemed subdued, tails tucked as they lay in the shade. Nathaniel carried himself like a man waiting for a spark, for the single word or gesture that would justify the fire already consuming him. Celeste remained in her chamber for much of the morning, the shutters drawn against the sun. She sat at the vanity, brushing her hair with long, measured strokes. The silver mirror reflected a face calm, composed, but her hands betrayed her. They trembled faintly each time she set the brush down. She thought of the night before, of Elias Carter's lingering eyes, of Nathaniel's silence that weighed heavier than any outburst could have. She knew suspicion was no longer just suspicion. It had taken root, had grown claws. She could feel it in the air that pressed against her, in the glances of the servants who avoided her gaze. Nathaniel was watching, always watching, and the question was no longer if he would act, but when. Downstairs, Samuel carried wood through the hall, his eyes sharp as always. He caught sight of Nathaniel standing rigid at the parlor window, staring out across the yard, as if the land itself might whisper its secrets to him. Samuel slowed his steps, lingering just long enough to notice the half-empty glass on the table, the papers strewn in disarray, the master's jaw tight with contained rage. Samuel had learned to read men like Nathaniel. He could see the storm gathering, and though it was not his storm, it would sweep him too if he was not careful. Still, curiosity tugged at him. The mistress's restless walks, the master's sleepless nights. Samuel stored it all, every scrap of detail, though he told no one. Not yet. At noon, the heat drove everyone inside. Ruth moved quietly between rooms, carrying trays, pouring water, eyes lowered, but she too felt the tremor beneath the surface. She had been in the Harwood house long enough to know the signs. She remembered years past when Nathaniel had flown into fury over less. A missing coin, a misplaced letter, a whisper of disrespect. Each had unleashed punishment swift and merciless. And now this, a wife's suspected betrayal. Ruth shuddered to think how far his hand might reach. She tried to keep her mind on her work, but every sound of raised voice or slammed door sent her heart pounding. She prayed silently that the storm would pass. But storms rarely passed without breaking something. That evening, Nathaniel demanded Celeste join him in the study. His voice carried through the halls, clipped, controlled, but hard as iron. Celeste descended the stairs slowly, her hand grazing the rail, her expression unreadable. She entered the study like a queen entering a courtroom, her head high though her heart raced. Nathaniel stood near the fireplace, one hand gripping the mantel, the other clenched at his side. He did not greet her. He did not offer a seat. He simply turned his gaze upon her, a weight that pressed harder than any hand. "You have been restless," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "You wander the gardens at night. You linger with guests longer than propriety demands. Do you take me for a blind man, Celeste?" She met his gaze, her face composed, though her pulse hammered in her throat. "I take you for a suspicious man, Nathaniel. and suspicion is a disease that eats its host before it touches its prey. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment Nathaniel said nothing. Then he turned away, pacing once across the room, his hand brushing papers from the desk. "Do not toy with me," he hissed. "I will know the truth, and when I do, there will be no mercy." Unseen beyond the cracked door, Samuel had paused, basket in hand. He heard every word, though he dared not breathe too loudly. He slipped away before he could be discovered, but the words burned in his ears. No mercy. He carried them back to the kitchen, where Ruth saw the shadow in his eyes. She asked nothing, but she knew. The house was becoming a tinderbox, and soon enough someone would strike the match. That night, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. The fields whispered in the wind, the crickets chirped, but the house was tense, its silence sharper than any sound. Nathaniel prowled again, unable to sleep, moving from room to room. He checked the locks, the windows, the doors. At times he thought he heard footsteps beyond the walls, saw movement in the corner of his vision. Once, near midnight, he swore he saw a figure in the garden, pale gown glimmering under the moonlight. He rushed outside, but the path was empty, the roses swaying only with the wind. He stood there, breath ragged, the night pressing close around him. When he returned inside, Celeste's chamber door was closed, her lamp extinguished. For the first time, Nathaniel felt doubt gnaw at him. Was it imagination, or truth slipping just out of reach? Celeste, alone behind her locked door, leaned against the wood, her heart hammering. She had walked the garden earlier, yes, but she had returned before Nathaniel prowled the halls. Still, she knew he was watching, knew he would not rest until he had broken through the veil she so carefully wove. She pressed her hand against her chest, willing her heart to slow, willing her mind to remain sharp. Fear was a weakness she could not afford. If Nathaniel believed she had betrayed him, then her life would be worth less than the soil beneath her feet. She whispered a prayer she did not believe in, then extinguished the last candle and lay awake until dawn, eyes wide in the darkness. In the quarters beyond the fields, whispers carried on the night air. The slaves spoke quietly, voices low, glances darting. They had seen the mistress in the garden, seen the master's rage simmering. They knew the signs of violence, had lived with them, bore the scars. Some pitied the mistress, others cursed her recklessness, but all agreed on one thing. The house was trembling, and when it fell, the crash would be felt by all. Samuel lay awake too, staring at the low ceiling of his cabin, replaying the words he had overheard. No mercy. He thought of the mistress's pale face, the master's hard eyes. He thought of the balance of power, of how quickly it could tilt, of what opportunities might rise in the chaos. For Samuel, fear mixed with a dangerous spark of hope. By the time the rooster crowed, Nathaniel had made a decision. He would set a trap, subtle, unseen. If his wife thought she could outwit him, she would soon learn otherwise. He would not confront her again, not yet. Instead, he would watch, he would wait, he would gather proof undeniable, and when the moment came when her guilt was exposed for all to see, he would unleash the fury that burned within him. His name would not be mocked, his household not shamed. He would make an example so severe that no one, wife, neighbor, or servant, would ever dare test him again. The day broke bright, but the shadows only deepened. Each step, each glance, each word carried the weight of impending reckoning. The Harwood plantation was no longer simply a place of labor and order. It was a stage upon which a tragedy gathered strength, unseen by none, inevitable as the turning of the seasons. And within its walls, every soul knew, the storm was no longer coming. It was here. The sun rose blood orange through a veil of mist, staining the fields in muted crimson, as though the earth itself carried some hidden wound. Nathaniel Harwood stood at the edge of the veranda, hat in hand, eyes scanning the horizon. He had not slept more than a handful of hours, yet his body was taut, restless, alive with the determination of a man who had set himself a course from which there could be no deviation. He told himself the waiting was almost done, that patience had been his virtue long enough. Now he would act, not rashly. No, Nathaniel believed himself a man of measured justice, but with the deliberate cruelty of a judge who delivers a sentence already decided. His household would bend to his will once more, and any hand that reached against it would be crushed. Inside, Celeste dressed slowly, her maid fastening the hooks of her gown with trembling fingers. She stared at herself in the mirror, porcelain skin pale in the morning light. She remembered a time when her beauty had been a shield, a weapon, an assurance that rooms would open and men would kneel. But beauty was fragile currency in a house where suspicion ruled. Nathaniel's eyes no longer lingered with desire but with scrutiny, as if every gesture, every breath, might be weighed as evidence. She adjusted the ribbon at her collar, forcing her face into composure, into the serene mask that had carried her through countless evenings of society. But in her chest, her heart beat frantic, like a bird trapped behind glass. She whispered to herself that she would not falter, that she would not break. Yet her reflection seemed to whisper back, "The storm is coming, and it will consume you first." In the kitchen, Ruth kneaded dough with slow, steady motions, her thoughts elsewhere. She had seen the master's look that morning, had heard the clipped tone in his voice as he gave orders. A reckoning was close, she felt it in her bones. She thought of Celeste, pale and proud, and wondered whether the mistress understood how thin the ice beneath her feet had grown. Ruth pitied her in some distant, cautious way, but pity did not change the truth. When Nathaniel unleashed his fury, no shield would hold. She pressed her hands harder into the dough, the rhythm steadying her. Survival, she told herself, keep your head down, hold your tongue, and survive the storm. Samuel, however, could not keep his curiosity quiet. He moved through the house under pretense of errands, eyes sharp, ears open. He saw the way Nathaniel's gaze followed Celeste, the way her laughter sounded brittle, the way every servant in the house moved with the careful steps of those who sensed danger at their backs. Samuel had learned to measure opportunity in the spaces between fear. Where others saw only peril, he glimpsed possibility. If the house cracked open, if scandal or violence tore through it, what secrets might spill? Secrets could be bartered. Secrets could buy a man more than his station would ever allow. But opportunity was also risk, and risk could be death. Samuel balanced them in his mind, though the weight of temptation pulled heavier each day. That afternoon, a letter arrived from Montgomery, sealed with wax, addressed to Celeste in a hand Nathaniel did not recognize. The butler brought it on a silver tray, eyes lowered, but Nathaniel's gaze caught the unfamiliar script instantly. His hand shot out, intercepting the letter before it could reach his wife. Celeste's face did not flicker, though her stomach dropped. Nathaniel studied the seal, the curves of the ink, his jaw tightening. Slowly, deliberately, he handed it over. "Read it aloud," he said, his voice even. Celeste unfolded the paper with graceful calm, though her fingers trembled inside the folds of her skirt. The letter contained only a polite note from a dressmaker confirming an order placed weeks earlier, nothing more. She read it clearly, steadily, then folded it back and placed it on the tray. Nathaniel's eyes bored into her, seeking the smallest crack. When he found none, he dismissed the butler with a wave. "Very well," he said, though his tone carried no ease. Celeste excused herself soon after, ascending the stairs with measured steps, but her breath escaped her in a rush the moment she closed her chamber door. She pressed her hands to her face, that had been too close, far too close. Nathaniel returned to his study, poured bourbon, and stared at the untouched glass. His mind whirled. A letter, innocent on its surface, yet could it have been? Could she have arranged for messages hidden within? Could she have allies beyond his sight? The thought gnawed at him, each possibility another ember feeding the fire. He began pacing, muttering under his breath. He would know. He would strip away her masks, tear down her lies, and when he did, there would be no forgiveness. That night, as the house quieted, Nathaniel set his plan into motion. He told Ruth to ensure that lamps remained lit longer than usual, that the halls should not be left in darkness. He ordered Samuel to patrol the grounds, though the boy had never been tasked with such a duty before. Eyes open, Nathaniel said, his voice low, dangerous, "If anything stirs, anything at all, you tell me." Samuel nodded, though his mind raced. He understood the trap being laid, but he also understood that knowledge of the master's schemes was itself a dangerous kind of power. He would watch, yes, but he would decide what to share and what to keep. Celeste felt the net closing. She moved through the house with practiced grace, but her every step was shadowed, her every breath measured. She longed for the freedom of the garden, the cool air beneath the arbor, but she dared not wander. Nathaniel's eyes were everywhere, and the servants' eyes too, some loyal, some fearful, some calculating. She retreated to her chamber, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window, staring out at the moonlit fields. For the first time in years she allowed herself to admit fear, not of scandal, not of humiliation, but of what Nathaniel might do if he believed her guilty. She whispered into the night, words carried away by the wind, "Lord, deliver me." Whether it was prayer or plea, she herself did not know. In the cabins the whispers spread. The mistress was trapped, the master enraged, and something was coming that would leave no one untouched. The slaves spoke quietly, huddled by dim lanterns, their voices low. Some hoped the household might collapse, others feared the violence that would surely come. Ruth listened but said little. She knew better than to fan flames or quench them. Samuel, however, listened keenly, storing each rumor, each speculation. He saw the lines being drawn, and he knew that when the storm broke, those who chose wisely might find themselves in places they had never dreamed possible. Near midnight, Nathaniel prowled the halls again, silent as a predator. He paused outside Celeste's door, listening. The silence mocked him. He pressed his hand against the wood, tempted to burst through, to demand confession, but no patience. He must have proof. He must catch her in the act. Only then could his wrath be justified, his punishment unassailable. He withdrew, footsteps muffled as he returned to the shadows. Yet even in retreat his resolve hardened. He would not wait much longer. Celeste lay awake on the other side of the door, her breath shallow, her body rigid. She had heard him there, felt the weight of his presence. She knew the walls were closing, the noose tightening. In her mind she raced through possibilities, letters, allies, escapes. But each path seemed blocked, each chance already stolen. She closed her eyes and forced herself to stillness, though inside her soul screamed. She would endure, she must endure. But for how long? The night dragged on, heavy and endless, the house thrumming with unspoken dread. In the silence, everyone listened, the master hunting, the mistress hiding, the servants waiting. And somewhere in that silence, the truth coiled like a snake, ready to strike. The fifth night was thick with heat, the air heavy as though the sky itself were weighed down by secrets. The moon hung swollen and pale above the fields, casting the cotton rows in silver shadows. Nathaniel Harwood stood at the edge of the veranda, coat cast aside, sleeves rolled, his eyes never still. His jaw was clenched, his breath shallow, every nerve strung tight. Tonight would bring clarity. He had waited, watched, measured each step with care, and now his patience sharpened into purpose. His household was a stage, and he the director of the final act. The trap was set. All that remained was for his wife to stumble into it. Inside, the house was unnaturally bright, lamps burning in every hallway as Nathaniel had commanded. The servants moved about uneasily, carrying trays, polishing brass that needed no polish, their movements a cover for their ears and eyes. Ruth's hands ached from the endless work, yet she welcomed it, for stillness meant thought, and thought meant fear. She had seen the master's expression, had seen the mistress's pale face vanish behind her chamber door, and she knew that something terrible was about to break. She whispered to Samuel as he passed in the hall, "Keep quiet tonight. Don't let your curiosity cost you your hide. But Samuel only nodded with a half-smile, his eyes gleaming. He had no intention of being blind. Tonight knowledge might be worth more than gold. Celeste dressed in white that evening, a gown light as air, its folds drifting like smoke when she moved. She chose it deliberately, for it gave her the look of innocence, of purity untouchable. She pinned her hair high, fastened a pearl at her throat, and stared at her reflection until she almost believed the lie herself. She told herself she was still in control, that Nathaniel might watch and wait, but he had no proof. Without proof he was only a jealous man, and jealous men could be tamed, managed, endured. Yet beneath her calm exterior her stomach twisted. She could feel the eyes on her, the servants, her husband, even the very walls seemed to lean closer. She lit a candle and carried it through the hall as if she were the mistress of peace, not the prisoner of suspicion. But with each step her hand trembled, and she knew that her composure was her last shield. Nathaniel dined with her in silence, the table stretched wide between them. The silver glinted, the candles flickered, but no words bridged the gulf. Celeste lifted her glass, smiled faintly, spoke of trifles, the weather, the roses, the approaching harvest. Nathaniel gave only short answers, his eyes fixed, his mind elsewhere. He was measuring her still, searching for the flicker of guilt, the crack in the mask. He told himself he would find it tonight. He could almost taste it in the air, bitter as smoke. When the meal ended, he excused himself to the study. Celeste lingered in the dining room, her hand trailing the rim of her glass, her mind racing. She felt the net tightening and longed to escape the house, to breathe air not thick with suspicion. She rose, her gown whispering across the floor, and drifted toward the garden. She told herself she would only walk beneath the arbor, only breathe the night air. It was nothing more than habit, yet deep within she knew the danger of even a single step beyond the walls. Still, she went. She could not bear the prison of silence any longer. Samuel saw her first, slipping through the side door, candle snuffed, gown trailing pale in the moonlight. He froze in the shadows, heart quickening. There she was, the mistress, walking into the garden alone. He knew the master was watching tonight, knew the trap had been laid, and yet curiosity burned too fiercely. He crouched behind the lattice, eyes fixed on her, every breath shallow. Ruth's warning echoed in his mind, but he could not turn away. The night itself seemed to lean toward her, the roses trembling in the faint breeze, the gravel crunching under her steps. She paused beneath the arbor, lifted her face to the sky, and closed her eyes. For a moment she looked like a figure carved in marble, serene, untouchable. Then the sound of a branch snapping shattered the stillness. Nathaniel emerged from the shadows like a blade drawn from its sheath, his figure tall, his face set in fury. "So," he said, his voice low, deadly calm, "the garden again, alone, always alone." Celeste's eyes snapped open, her body rigid. She forced a smile, soft, practiced. "The air was stifling, Nathaniel. I only wished to breathe." He stepped closer, the gravel grinding beneath his boots. "Breathe, or meet." His words struck like blows. Celeste lifted her chin, refusing to cower. "If you think I would disgrace you so, then you think little of the woman you married." Nathaniel's hand shot out, gripping her wrist, hard enough to make her gasp. "I think," he whispered, his face inches from hers, "that you take me for a fool, but I will show you who is the fool in this house." Unseen by either, Samuel crouched lower, heart pounding. He should flee, he knew it. Yet he remained rooted, eyes wide. He was witnessing the unraveling of power, the moment when suspicion became accusation, when accusation became danger. He would carry this memory like a weapon, sharp and dangerous. But even he did not know where the blade would fall. Celeste wrenched her wrist free, her eyes blazing. "You will not make a spectacle of me, Nathaniel. You will not drag me through the mud of your jealous rage." But her voice trembled, and he heard it. He smiled then, a terrible smile, cold as steel. "Spectacle? No, my dear. I will make an example." The words hung in the night like a curse. Celeste's breath caught, fear flashing across her face before she could bury it beneath composure. Nathaniel saw it, and his grip tightened on the certainty that she was guilty. He would have his proof. He would tear it from the night if he must. At that moment, Ruth appeared at the edge of the garden, carrying a lantern. She froze as she saw them, her eyes widening. The master and mistress locked in confrontation, their voices low but sharp, the tension thick enough to choke the air. Nathaniel turned his head sharply, his gaze striking her like a lash. "Back inside," he ordered. Ruth hesitated only a second, then bowed her head and withdrew, but she had seen enough. She knew the storm was breaking. She knew blood would follow. Celeste pulled her arm from Nathaniel's grip, her voice steadier now, though her eyes betrayed her fear. "If you seek to shame me, you shame yourself. Remember that." She turned, gown swirling, and walked back toward the house. Nathaniel stood in the garden, fists clenched, chest heaving. He had not broken her yet. But he would. He vowed it to the stars above. He would break her, and in breaking her, he would restore his name, his power, his control. Samuel slipped away before Nathaniel could notice him, his mind racing. He had heard every word, seen every gesture, the mistress's defiance, the master's threat. This was knowledge too potent to ignore. He felt both fear and exhilaration, as if he carried a flame in his hands. If he spoke, he might burn. If he stayed silent, he might survive, but silence could also mean wasted opportunity. He returned to his cabin with his heart thundering, the choice gnawing at him. That night, the Harwood house did not sleep. Nathaniel paced until dawn. Celeste wept silently behind her locked door. Ruth prayed in the kitchen, and Samuel lay awake, staring into the darkness, weighing his future. The plantation itself seemed to shift, its foundation trembling, its air heavy with dread. The reckoning Nathaniel had promised was no longer a threat on the horizon. It was here, pressing against the walls, waiting for the moment to strike. And when it came, no one within those acres would escape its shadow. The sun rose over Harwood Plantation as if it carried with it the weight of judgment. The morning air was heavy, and the sky was already stained with red, as though the horizon itself had been cut and bled into the day. Nathaniel stood on the porch with a glass of brandy in hand, though it was far too early for drink. His eyes scanned the fields, but he did not see cotton or labor. He saw an audience. He saw a stage, the ground upon which he would restore his dignity. He whispered under his breath words that were neither prayer nor promise, but something darker, something only he understood. The enslaved workers felt the shift as well. They moved about their tasks in silence, their bodies going through motions, but their minds listening for sounds that would carry from the house. The air felt wrong. Even the birds that usually filled the morning with sound seemed muted, subdued. Samuel worked near the stables, hands steady on the brush as he cleaned a horse, but his eyes kept lifting toward the house. He could not shake the memory of the garden confrontation, nor the echo of Nathaniel's words, "I will make an example." He repeated them in his mind until they seemed to throb with menace. He thought of speaking to Ruth, of warning her, but Ruth already knew. Ruth always knew. Inside the house, Celeste dressed with trembling hands. She chose a gown of blue silk, elegant yet somber, as though it might soften Nathaniel's fury. Her fingers fumbled over the buttons, and twice she dropped the clasp of her necklace before fastening it at her throat. She caught her reflection in the mirror, her face pale, her lips drawn tight, her eyes wide with a dread she could not hide. She told herself she must remain composed, that strength lay in control, but her body betrayed her. Her hands shook, her chest rose and fell too quickly, and the fear that churned in her stomach threatened to spill from her in every gesture. When she descended the staircase, she found Nathaniel waiting in the parlor, seated like a judge upon his throne. He did not rise when she entered. His eyes raked over her, cold and deliberate, as if measuring whether she was prepared to face what he had decided. "We will have company tonight," he said at last, his voice smooth, deceptively calm. Celeste froze mid-step, her hand tightening on the banister. "Company?" she asked, her voice careful, too careful. Nathaniel nodded. "Yes, it is time that appearances are restored." Too long this house has been shadowed by whispers. Tonight, we will show them strength. We will show them unity. Celeste's heart thudded painfully. She understood what he meant. He would not confront her in silence any longer. He would make her humiliation spectacle, her punishment a sermon. She felt the room tilt, but she forced her body to remain steady. She lifted her chin and said softly, "If unity is what you want, then do not destroy it with spectacle." Nathaniel smiled then, but it was not a smile of warmth. It was a smile sharp as glass. "Unity," he murmured, "is forged by fire. Tonight the fire will burn and all will see." Ruth overheard from the hall, her heart sinking. She pressed her palm against the wall as though to steady herself, then turned away quickly before Nathaniel's gaze could find her. She hurried back to the kitchen, her breath shallow. She knew what company meant. It meant witnesses. It meant the master intended to make public whatever wrath he had planned for the mistress. She whispered to the others as they worked, "He's calling them. Tonight, be ready." The words passed from ear to ear, each face darkening, each pair of eyes reflecting dread. For what harmed the mistress would ripple outward, touching them all. By afternoon, carriages began to roll down the road toward Harwood. Wealthy neighbors, men with their wives dressed in finery, curious eyes glittering, the kind of audience Nathaniel craved, gentry who thrived on whispers, who would carry whatever they saw into parlors across the county. They arrived smiling, unaware of the storm waiting inside. Nathaniel greeted them at the door with a mask of warmth, his voice steady, his gestures refined. He offered drinks, spoke of crops, laughed at trifles. To the outsider, he was the perfect host, but his eyes never softened, never strayed far from Celeste. Celeste moved among the guests like a ghost. She smiled when spoken to, she laughed when prompted, but inside she felt her ribs closing in upon her lungs. Every gaze that lingered on her felt like a knife. She could sense Nathaniel watching, measuring her every word, her every glance. She longed to flee, to run from the house, from the county, from the life that had trapped her. But her feet remained tethered, her body bound by fear. She lifted a glass of wine to her lips, but the liquid turned bitter in her mouth. The enslaved workers were made to serve that evening, moving silently among the guests with trays of food and drink. Samuel carried a silver platter, his eyes lowered, but he absorbed every word. Ruth poured wine with hands that trembled only slightly, her face composed though her heart pounded. They had no choice but to be part of the charade, their presence both invisible and essential. Yet in their silence, they saw more than any guest. They saw the mistress's fear, the master's hunger for dominance, and they understood that what unfolded tonight would mark them all. As dusk fell, Nathaniel rose from his seat, his glass raised. The guests quieted, their attention turning toward him. "My friends," he began, his voice rich and commanding, "you honor me with your presence. Tonight we gather not merely to share food and drink, but to affirm the strength of this house. In times of trial, it is not wealth or land that preserve a name. It is honor, and honor must be defended." His words hung heavy, and though the guests exchanged glances, none spoke. Celeste's hand tightened around her glass until it nearly cracked. She felt the room closing in, each face turning toward her, each ear straining for what would come next. Nathaniel set down his glass and extended his hand toward Celeste. "My wife," he said, his tone both affectionate and edged, "is the jewel of this house. Yet jewels must be guarded, lest tarnish steal their shine. Tonight we restore what is rightfully ours, unity, trust, and truth." He gestured for her to stand beside him. Celeste felt her knees weaken, but she rose, forcing her body to obey. She walked to him, her gown trailing behind like water. She stood at his side, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain all could hear it. The guests watched in uneasy silence. Some shifted in their chairs, sensing the tension, but unwilling to intervene. Nathaniel's smile broadened as he placed a hand lightly on Celeste's shoulder, a gesture of possession more than affection. "There have been whispers," he said slowly, his voice carrying through the hall, "whispers that strike at the very foundation of what we hold dear, whispers that I, as husband and master, cannot allow to fester. Tonight, before friends and witnesses, truth will be revealed." Celeste's breath caught. She wanted to cry out, to deny, to flee, but she forced her lips closed. She would not give him the satisfaction of begging. Her silence was her only weapon left. She lifted her chin and stared at the far wall, refusing to meet the guest's eyes. Nathaniel squeezed her shoulder, then released it, stepping forward as though preparing to unveil a final act. In the kitchen, Ruth's hands gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. She whispered a prayer under her breath, though she knew prayer alone might not stop what was coming. Samuel slipped into the shadows of the doorway, peering out into the hall, his heart racing. He did not know what proof the master claimed to have, nor what punishment he intended to mete out, but he knew this was only the beginning. As Nathaniel turned back toward his guests, his eyes gleaming, Celeste closed her own and summoned the last of her strength. Whatever he revealed, whatever humiliation he laid upon her, she swore she would not break, yet deep inside, fear gnawed at her resolve. The storm had arrived, and she was standing at its center. And as the first rumble of thunder rolled faintly across the horizon outside, the hall itself seemed to hold its breath. The storm broke the moment Nathaniel raised his hand. A clap of thunder rattled the windows, though the sky had offered no warning, and the lamps in the great hall flickered as though the house itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. The guests leaned forward, their faces pale, uncertain whether they were about to witness drama or disgrace. Celeste stood rigid at his side, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles whitened. Nathaniel's eyes swept the room, triumphant, alive with cruel anticipation. "My friends," he said again, his voice rising like a preacher at the pulpit, "you have come here tonight as witnesses, not only to fellowship but to truth. For too long, this house has been poisoned by shadows. Tonight, those shadows are banished. Tonight, honor is restored." He turned sharply, his gaze falling on Celeste with the weight of an executioner's blade. "There are those who say my wife has betrayed her vows, has sullied the very foundation of this family. I will not allow such whispers to fester any longer. Tonight you will see with your own eyes what must be done." A murmur rippled through the guests. Ladies pressed gloved hands to their lips. Gentlemen shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They had come expecting hospitality, perhaps drama, but not this. Not a public trial of a woman by her husband. Yet none dared rise, none dared leave. The force of Nathaniel's voice, his reputation, his authority held them captive. Celeste drew a breath and stepped forward, her chin lifted high. "And what proof do you claim, Nathaniel?" she asked, her voice clear though her body trembled. "What evidence do you dare present before these neighbors who once called me friend? Or is accusation enough for you to destroy what dignity remains in this house?" Her words cut like steel, and for a brief moment the guests turned their eyes from Nathaniel to her, as if wondering whether she might indeed stand innocent. But Nathaniel's smile widened, and with a sharp gesture he called into the hall. Two men stepped forward, overseers from the plantation, men whose loyalty to him was unquestioned. Between them they dragged a young field hand, his wrists bound with rope, his face bruised. The hall gasped. Celeste's body went rigid, her blood cold. Samuel, watching from the doorway, felt bile rise in his throat. He knew the boy, Isaiah, scarcely more than 19, quiet, diligent, unassuming. His presence here could only mean one thing. Nathaniel pointed, his voice thundering. Here is the proof of betrayal. This boy was caught wandering where he had no right, near the mistress's chambers, under cover of night. Do you think it was chance? Do you think innocence drives a slave to prowl the halls of his master's house? His words echoed, twisting accusation into certainty. The guests murmured louder now, some nodding, others whispering uneasily. Celeste staggered back a step, her breath shattering. "It's a lie." she cried, her voice breaking. "This is madness, Nathaniel. You know this is madness." But Nathaniel raised his hand again, silencing her as if she were no more than a child. "No, my dear, what is madness is to think you could deceive me, to think I would not see, to think I would not act. Tonight, before all, you will confess, or I will let him confess for you." He turned to Isaiah, who stood trembling between the overseers, his eyes wide with terror. The boy tried to speak, his voice thin. "Master, I never—" But a blow from one overseer's fist silenced him, his lips splitting. Samuel clenched his teeth, his hands curling into fists in the shadow of the doorway. Ruth, standing behind him, pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. Celeste rushed forward, placing herself between Nathaniel and the boy. Her gown brushed the floor, her hair falling loose from its pins, her breath ragged. "If you harm him," she said, her voice fierce despite the tears streaming down her cheeks, "then you are the only betrayer here. Do you hear me, Nathaniel? You with your madness, your pride, your hunger to be worshipped. I will not bow to your cruelty." The hall fell into stunned silence. The guests stared, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. No woman, no wife, ever spoke so to a husband before such company. Nathaniel's face darkened, his mask of control cracking. His voice came low, shaking with fury. "Then you admit it." "I admit nothing but your cruelty." Celeste spat, her voice steady now. "Strike me, humiliate me, do what you will. But I will not give you the words you hunger for. And I will not let you destroy an innocent boy to satisfy your rage." For a moment, Nathaniel stood frozen, his hand raised as if to strike her, his body taut with violence. Then something shifted in the hall. The guests, who had sat silent until now, began to murmur in tones that no longer carried agreement, but disquiet, even disapproval. A wealthy neighbor cleared his throat. "Nathaniel, perhaps this is not—" His voice faltered under Nathaniel's glare, but the damage was done. The whisper of dissent had entered the air. Celeste turned to the crowd, her voice ringing out. "You all see it. You all see what I have endured. If none of you will speak, then know this: my silence will not save him." She gestured toward Isaiah, still trembling, blood on his lip. "His life is the price my husband demands for his pride. If you condone this, then you are as guilty as he." The words cracked like thunder through the hall. The guests shifted, their unease growing. No one rose to defend her outright, but their silence now carried weight against Nathaniel's authority. He felt it, like sand slipping beneath his boots. Rage consumed him, but he could not lash out at them as he did at his wife. He turned instead to the boy, his eyes blazing. "Take him out," he ordered, but Samuel moved before the overseers could obey. He stepped from the doorway into the light, his voice clear and loud. "He did nothing, master. I swear it. He's innocent." His sudden defiance shocked the room into silence. Nathaniel stared at him, disbelief flaring into murderous anger. "You dare speak?" he hissed. "Yes," Samuel said, his voice steady though his heart thundered, "because the truth you want ain't there. You can bind us, beat us, but you can't twist what ain't real." The guests gasped, scandalized by the audacity, but the words struck like sparks in dry grass. Ruth stepped forward then, placing herself beside Samuel. "He tells the truth," she said firmly, "and I seen enough to know lies when they're spoken." The overseers hesitated, looking to Nathaniel for command, but the room had shifted. The guests now whispered in tones of disapproval, some openly appalled. The spectacle Nathaniel had planned had turned against him. His hand shook as he reached for his glass, but his grip faltered, and the crystal shattered on the floor. Celeste stood tall, her tears drying on her cheeks, her voice calm now, almost cold. "Your truth has collapsed, Nathaniel. Look at them. Look at what they see. You wanted to make me a spectacle. Instead, you have made yourself one." The hall was silent but for the storm raging outside. Nathaniel's chest rose and fell, his fury unspent but his power fractured. He turned on his heel and strode from the room, the doors slamming behind him with a crash that echoed like a gunshot. The guests shifted uneasily, some rising, some whispering hurried farewells as they made their way out into the storm. None dared linger in the ruins of his pride. Celeste sank into a chair, her body trembling as though every muscle had turned to water. Samuel and Ruth stood in the shadows, their hearts still pounding, knowing the danger was far from over, but also knowing something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and nothing would ever be the same. Isaiah was led back toward the quarters, his bonds cut, his shoulders trembling with relief. The storm raged on outside, rain lashing against the windows, thunder cracking overhead. Within the house, silence stretched, broken only by Celeste's ragged breaths. She had not been broken. Nathaniel had not won. But the cost of defiance, she knew, was yet to be measured. And in the darkness of his study, Nathaniel Harwood poured himself another glass, his hand shaking, his mind ablaze with vengeance. The night had humiliated him, but his war was not finished. No, it had only begun. This was just one tale in the ritual of fear. Subscribe now, watch again, and face the next story with me.